The portrait was buried under dust, wrapped in an old cloth that smelled faintly of mildew and hay. It was found in late September when the morning still carried a thin mist over the cornfields and the sound of crickets hadn't yet disappeared. The barn was quiet that day, except for the occasional shuffle of rats in the rafters and the low hum of the wind slipping through the gaps in the wooden boards. The farmer, Elias, wasn't looking for anything special, just clearing space before winter came. He had lived on that land all his life, a quiet man of few words, known in the small Missouri town as someone who minded his own business. But when he unwrapped that painting and looked into the woman's face, something in the air changed. At first he thought it was just a portrait, an old one maybe from a family that had lived there long before him. The woman in the painting had pale skin and soft brown hair pinned neatly behind her ears. Her eyes were large and steady, the kind that made you feel like she was looking through you rather than at you. Behind her was the faint outline of what looked like a barn, his barn or one that looked just like it. Elias stared for a long while, feeling a strange pull in his stomach, like he was remembering something he never actually lived through. The house he lived in was small, the kind that creaked at night and smelled faintly of old wood and rain. He had lived alone since his wife had passed 5 years earlier. The neighbors didn't see him much anymore except when he went into town for supplies or to sell what little he grew. People said grief had made him quieter, more distant. But Elias wasn't cruel or strange, just lonely in the way people become when there's no one left to talk to but the wind. The town of Clearwater was the sort of place where nothing ever really changed. There were about 600 people in total, most of them old farm families whose names were carved into the local cemetery's headstones. Everyone knew everyone else's business. There was comfort in that, but also suffocation. Secrets didn't last long in Clearwater. Yet, for some reason, the farm had always been a place people didn't ask too many questions about. The land was said to be heavy. No one explained what that meant, but it came up often in whispers, especially among the older folks. That night after finding the painting, Elias carried it into the house and set it on the kitchen table. The lamplight flickered over the cracked glass, revealing small scratches across the frame as though someone had tried to erase the image long ago. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from it, staring in silence. The more he looked, the stranger it felt. There was something about the barn in the background, its color, its structure, that made his skin prickle. It wasn't just similar to his. It was his, down to the leaning, weather vane and the missing plank near the roof. The more he stared, the colder the room seemed to become. He told himself it was just his imagination, that the chill was from the drafty windows. Still, he got up, pulled the curtains shut, and placed the portrait against the wall. But that night he couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wind sounded closer, sharper. Around midnight, he thought he heard something moving in the barn, something heavy being dragged. When he stepped onto the porch and looked out across the fields, everything was still. The barn stood dark and silent, its doors slightly open like a mouth waiting to speak. Before the painting, Elias' days followed a simple rhythm. Up before dawn, feed the animals, work the field, fix whatever needed fixing. He didn't talk to many people, though once a week he'd stop by the general store to see the woman who ran the counter. She was kind and soft-spoken, the type who remembered everyone's favorite brand of tobacco and asked about your crops even if she didn't care much about farming. She worried about Elias sometimes, how he was getting on, whether he ate properly. He always told her he was fine. Everyone told her they were fine. There was also Sheriff Tanner, who occasionally drove by to check on the outer farms. He'd been in Clearwater nearly 20 years and had the calm, watchful eyes of a man who had seen more than he ever wanted to. He and Elias weren't exactly friends, but there was an understanding between them. They were both men who kept their thoughts close. Tanner had lost his own boy years back, hit by a drunk driver. Since then, he carried a quiet grief that showed only in the way he paused before speaking, as if choosing every word carefully so none of them broke him open. When people talked about Clearwater, they said it was safe, peaceful, but safety is often just an illusion, something built from habit and denial. Beneath the quiet of small towns, things often fester. Old arguments, family feuds, forgotten crimes. People pretend not to see them, but the land remembers. It always does. And lately there had been talk among the townsfolk, small things going missing, strange sounds near the woods, animals found dead without a clear reason. Folks brushed it off as wild dogs or bad luck, but some whispered that it was something older, something tied to the land itself. Elias didn't believe in that kind of talk, at least not until he found the portrait. Something about it unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. The next morning he thought about taking it to the sheriff or maybe to the antique dealer in town, but something in him stopped, a feeling that the portrait wasn't done with him yet. He left it where it was, leaning against the kitchen wall, covered again with that old cloth. Yet every time he passed the table, he could feel its presence, like the woman in the painting was still watching, still waiting. A week passed and Elias started noticing small things around the farm, footprints near the barn that weren't his. A strange smell, sweet and rotten, drifting from the hayloft. One morning he found the barn door wide open, even though he remembered locking it the night before. The animals were restless, the horses snorting and packing, the cows refusing to go near the back stalls. He told himself it was just raccoons, but deep down he knew better. It wasn't long before stopped seeing Elias in town. The lights at his farmhouse stayed off most nights, and when the sheriff drove by, he found the gate open, the fields overgrown. The place looked abandoned again, the way it had before Elias' father took it over 50 years ago. But if you stood still long enough near the barn, you could hear something faint, a low, muffled sound like whispering carried on the wind. No one knew then what the portrait really was or what it meant. But the moment Elias found it, the past began to stir. The kind of past that doesn't stay buried no matter how deep you hide it. And if anyone had looked close enough at that painting, really close, they might have noticed something odd in the corner of the frame, something faint but unmistakable. A small figure half hidden by the shadows of the barn, watching, always watching. The days after finding the portrait began to bleed into one another, marked by strange, subtle changes that Elias couldn't quite explain. The air around the farm felt different, thicker somehow, like the land itself was holding its breath. He kept the painting covered now, though sometimes at night he swore he could still feel her eyes through the cloth. The woman's gaze lingered in his thoughts, showing up in his dreams, her face soft at first, then shifting into something colder. When he woke, his sheets were damp with sweat, and the silence of the house felt almost alive. It wasn't long before Elias started hearing things. It began with footsteps in the barn, slow, dragging steps that stopped whenever he got close. Then came whispers, faint and uneven, like someone speaking just behind him but never clear enough to understand. He told himself it was loneliness playing tricks on his mind. But the more he tried to ignore it, the stronger it grew. Some nights he caught himself staring out the window toward the barn, unable to look away. The lamp inside would flicker even when he hadn't lit it. Noticed the change in him the next time he came into town. His clothes were wrinkled, his hands trembling as he handed her a list of supplies. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. When she asked how he was, he said nothing for a long time, then finally murmured, "There's something wrong with that place." She frowned, trying to draw him out, but he only shook his head. "It's just the house," he added quickly, as though saying it out loud might make it true. She tried to smile, but there was something in his eyes that unsettled her, something hollow. Sheriff Tanner, too, had started to notice things. Had mentioned her worries, so he took a drive out to the property one evening. The sun was setting low, bleeding orange across the fields. He found Elias in the barn, standing near a workbench with the portrait beside him. The cloth was gone this time, and the woman's face seemed almost luminous in the dim light. Tanner asked him where he'd found it, and Elias pointed to the attic, explaining in his slow, quiet way. "Been there a long time," he said. "Didn't think much of it, but it's strange, it feels like it's been watching me." Tanner stepped closer, his eyes narrowing at the painting. He wasn't the type to believe in curses or hauntings, but something about it made him uneasy. "Looks like one of those old-style portraits from the late 1800s, he said. "Maybe belonged to the family who lived here before yours." Elias nodded but didn't seem to hear him. He was staring past the painting, toward the back of the barn where the boards were slightly warped, letting in thin stripes of light. Tanner followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual. Before leaving, he told Elias to come into town more often. "You've been alone too long," he said softly. Elias just nodded again, eyes distant. At night, Tanner couldn't stop thinking about the painting. Something about it felt wrong. When he got home, he pulled an old property record from his files. The land had belonged to the Caldwell family before Elias' father bought it. There wasn't much detail, just a note from decades ago about missing persons and unresolved matters. The handwriting was smudged, the report incomplete. Tanner frowned. It wasn't like the sheriff before him to leave things unfinished. He made a mental note to dig deeper. Meanwhile, Elias' days grew more fractured. He stopped tending to his fields. The crops began to rot in the sun. The animals refused to go near the barn, and even the dogs barked at nothing. He spent hours sitting in the kitchen, the portrait leaning against the wall beside him, uncovered again. He told himself he needed to understand it to find out who she was. The woman in the painting became an obsession. Her face seemed to change depending on the light, sometimes softer, sometimes cruel. And sometimes, in the reflection of the window, he thought he saw her smile. tried visiting him once more. The house smelled of damp earth and old coffee. She found him sitting in the dark, mumbling under his breath. "Elias," she said gently, "you need to get out of here for a while." He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was flat. "She doesn't like it when people come here." Froze. "Who?" she whispered. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "The woman," he said simply. "The one in the portrait." She backed away then, fear tightening her chest. "You're scaring me," she said, but Elias didn't move. "You should go," he murmured, "before it gets dark." She left quickly, her heart pounding, not daring to look back at the house. After that, rumors began to spread through Clearwater. Some said Elias had gone mad from loneliness. Others whispered that he'd started talking to his dead wife again. But there were stranger stories too, about lights flickering in the barn, about voices echoing late at night, about a woman's laughter carried on the wind. Most people dismissed it as small-town gossip. Still, Tanner couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He went back to the station and dug through the archives again. Eventually, he found a newspaper clipping from 1912. It told of a family, Thomas and Caldwell, and their daughter, Rose. The article said Rose had disappeared one winter night, leaving behind only blood on the barn floor and a single painting. Thomas Caldwell was arrested but later found dead in his cell, hanging from a rope made from torn. The case was never solved. The article mentioned that the portrait was said to be painted by her husband before she vanished. Tanner's stomach turned. He stared at the yellowed photo of the barn in the article. It was the same one standing on Elias' land. He drove back out the next morning, heart heavy with dread. But when he arrived, the place was silent, no sign of Elias. The doors to the barn were wide open again, and the smell that came from inside was foul, like something dead had been left to rot. Tanner stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath his boots. Dust motes floated through the sunlight cutting in from the roof cracks. The portrait was there, resting on a bale of hay. But the woman's face was different now, her expression twisted, the soft features replaced by something cruel. And behind her, faintly painted into the shadows, was a figure that hadn't been there before. A man. His face was Elias. Tanner staggered back, bile rising in his throat. He ran his hand across his face, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks. But the unease in his chest wouldn't fade. He called out Elias' name, his voice echoing through the barn. No answer. A few hours later arrived two, worried after Elias hadn't come by for a week. She saw Tanner's truck and hurried over. The sheriff tried to stop her from going inside, but she pushed past him, her eyes darting around the dark interior. "Where is he?" she demanded. Tanner didn't answer right away. He was staring at the back wall where dark stains marred the wood. They looked old, but he couldn't be sure. That night, neither of them slept. Tanner returned home and poured himself a glass of whiskey, staring at the photo of the Caldwells. Sat in her kitchen, trembling every time the floor creaked. The portrait haunted them both. She couldn't shake the memory of Elias' words. She doesn't like it when people come here. Over the next few days, Tanner's investigation deepened. He found more fragments of the old Caldwell story, rumors of infidelity, debts, and jealousy. It seemed Thomas Caldwell had been a proud man, bitter about his failing crops and his wife's friendship with a neighbor. Some believed he had killed her in a fit of rage. Others said she'd cursed him before she disappeared. Whatever the truth, the land had been tainted ever since. For Elias, that curse seemed to have found its way back. He had started keeping a journal, scribbling strange sentences that made little sense. "She's here now," one line read. "She knows I see her." Another said, "The barn is breathing, it remembers." The handwriting grew more frantic with each entry. The last page was smeared and torn, but one phrase was still clear: "She wants to come back." Tanner read those pages under the dim light of his office, his hands trembling slightly. He knew he needed to go back to the farm, but a part of him was afraid of what he might find. When he finally did return, the place looked worse than before. The windows were broken and the front door hung half open. Inside, dust covered everything except for one clean spot on the kitchen floor where the portrait had once leaned. It was gone. Outside, near the barn, Tanner noticed something new, fresh footprints in the dirt. Not just Elias. Smaller ones too, leading toward the woods behind the property. He followed them until they disappeared into the trees. The sun was setting by then, and the forest was thick with shadows. As he turned back, he heard something faint, a whisper carried on the wind, low and distant but unmistakable. A woman's voice calling his name. By the time he reached his truck, night had fallen completely. He drove away fast, refusing to look in the mirror. Later, when he got home, he poured another drink and told himself he'd imagined it all. But when he turned toward the window, his breath caught in his throat. Through the glass, reflected faintly behind him, he saw the woman from the portrait, her pale face, her unblinking eyes, and just over her shoulder, the outline of the barn. He spun around, but the room was empty. The glass rattled slightly as a cold wind passed through the cracks. Somewhere far out in the fields beyond Clearwater, the barn door creaked open again, and this time it didn't close. The rain came without warning that night, hammering against the tin roof of the farmhouse in sharp, uneven bursts. The air was cold, the kind of cold that sinks into the bones and makes every breath feel heavy. Elias sat at the kitchen table, the portrait propped up in front of him again. The woman's eyes seemed darker now, the shadows behind her deeper. They flickered through the window, casting her face in flashes that made her look almost alive. Elias hadn't eaten in 2 days. His hands shook as he reached for the lamp, turning it higher. Outside, the wind howled across the open fields. The barn door banged again and again, slamming shut only to swing wide open. He had nailed it closed earlier that afternoon, but somehow it had loosened on its own. The sound gnawed at him like the land itself was demanding attention. Finally, he stood and grabbed his lantern. "All right," he muttered to himself. "All right then." He stepped into the storm, his boots sinking into the wet ground. The rain stung his skin, and the wind tore at his jacket as he made his way across the yard. Each flash of lightning revealed the same unsettling scene, the fields bending, the trees bowing under the wind, and the barn standing like a black silhouette against the night sky. When he reached the door, it stopped swinging. It was just hanging there, half open, waiting for him. Inside, the air was thick and damp. His lantern flickered, casting shaky circles of light across the hay-strewn floor. The smell was unbearable now, rotting wood mixed with something metallic like old blood. He moved slowly, his breath echoing off the walls. "Who's there?" he called out, though part of him already knew the answer. There was no one. There never was. And yet there was movement. A shadow darted near the back wall, quick and silent. Elias froze, holding his breath. The lantern trembled in his hand. "Show yourself," he whispered. But the shadow didn't stop. It seemed to melt into the boards, vanishing completely. He took a hesitant step forward, his boots scraping against the floor. That's when he saw it, a faint light coming from behind one of the support beams where the wood had split years ago. He knelt, moving the lantern closer. The beam had a hollow space behind it, and inside something glimmered. He reached in with shaking hands and pulled out a small metal locket covered in grime. The moment his fingers touched it, the air changed. The light from the lantern dimmed, and the sound of the rain seemed to vanish. The barn went silent, completely silent. Then a whisper soft right behind his ear. "Elias." He spun around, the lantern nearly slipping from his grasp. Standing only a few feet away was the woman from the painting. She was exactly as she appeared, same brown hair, same pale dress, but her eyes were darker than any paint could capture. Her lips moved, but the words didn't come out right, more like the sound of breath escaping a broken flute. He stepped back, heart pounding so violently it hurt. "You're not real," he said, his voice cracking. "You're not." But before he could finish, the lantern went out. Darkness swallowed everything. He heard her footsteps then, slow, steady, deliberate. The boards creaked under her weight. He stumbled backward, knocking into a rake, sending it clattering to the floor. His hands searched for the matches in his pocket, trembling too badly to strike one. "Leave me alone," he shouted into the dark. "I didn't do anything." The air grew colder, his breath visible even in the pitch black. Then came a faint light again, pale and blue, glowing from her outline. She was standing over him now. Her face had changed, no longer soft or sorrowful, but twisted, consumed by rage and something far older than pain. She reached for him, and though her hand looked like smoke, he felt it, cold like ice pressed against his chest. He screamed. The walls of the barn seemed to shudder, dust falling from the rafters. In a panic, Elias swung the lantern wildly. It hit the side of a beam and burst open, spilling fire onto the hay. Flames spread fast, licking up the walls, feeding on the dry wood. Within seconds, the barn was burning. The orange light revealed everything, her face, inches from his, her mouth open in a silent scream, and behind her, dozens of shapes moving in the smoke. Men, women, children, all pale, all still. "Watching." He stumbled toward the door, coughing as smoke filled his lungs. But the door had slammed shut again. He threw himself against it, clawing at the boards, desperate to get out. "Please," he shouted. "Please, I didn't do anything." But a voice answered back, low and trembling, echoing from every corner of the barn. "You found us." Outside, the rain poured harder, the fire crackling loudly beneath the storm. From the road, saw the glow rising into the night sky. She'd been driving out to the farm again against her better judgment. Something in her had told her to check on Elias one last time. Now, as she pulled up, she saw the barn engulfed in flames. Her hands shook as she ran toward it, calling his name. "Elias," she screamed. "Elias, where are you?" The heat was unbearable. She covered her mouth and tried to push through the thick smoke, but a beam collapsed in front of her, sending sparks into the air. Through the fire, she thought she saw him, his silhouette against the far wall, moving toward her. She called out again, but when he turned, she froze. His face was blank, his eyes unfocused, as if he didn't see her at all. And behind him, through the burning smoke, stood the woman. Stumbled back, choking. The woman's expression was calm now, almost peaceful as the flames wrapped around her. Elias reached toward her, then stopped. His body shuddered and he fell to his knees. The fire roared, the smoke thickened, and within moments both figures disappeared from view. By the time Sheriff Tanner arrived, the barn was nothing but a smoldering shell. The fire crew worked in silence, their faces grim. The rain had put out most of the blaze, but it was too late. They found Elias' body near the center of the barn, half buried under a fallen beam. His hands were burned, clenched tight around something. When his fingers opened, they found the locket inside, untouched by the fire. Tanner crouched beside him, his throat tight. The air smelled of ash and wet earth. Around the remains of the barn, the ground was soaked, yet something strange caught his eye: prints. Bare footprints, small ones, leading away from the wreckage toward the woods, too small to be Elias. He followed them for a few steps before they simply vanished. He looked back toward the ruins, the glow still flickering faintly in the rain. Among the ashes, half buried in the soot, was a piece of the portrait's frame. The canvas itself was gone, burned completely, but for some reason the frame was intact. Tanner picked it up slowly, brushing off the soot. As he turned it in his hands, something caught the light, a faint engraving on the back. 2 initials carved deep, T.C. Thomas Caldwell. A chill ran through him. He turned toward the open field, the wind howling low across the grass. For a moment he thought he saw a figure standing by the edge of the woods, a woman in a pale dress, watching. But when he blinked, she was gone. Stood behind him, silent, tears streaking down her face. "He didn't deserve this," she whispered. Tanner didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the blackened barn, smoke curling up into the night sky. Somewhere beneath it all, the fire, the ruin, the rain, there was a whisper, faint but unmistakable. A woman's voice carried softly through the wind. "Not done." Tanner swallowed hard, his hands tightening around the frame. The sound faded, leaving only the hiss of the dying fire. But deep down, he knew it wasn't over. The land had taken something back that night, and whatever it wasn't finished yet. The morning after the fire, Clearwater felt heavier than usual. Smoke hung low over the fields, curling in slow, ghostly ribbons as if reluctant to leave the land. The town's residents gathered at the edge of the property, umbrellas shaking in the drizzle, eyes wide at the blackened shell that had once been Elias' barn. No one spoke much at first, just murmurs, half-formed sentences carried on the damp wind. The barn had been a familiar landmark, the kind people barely noticed until it was gone. Now, with its charred beams and scorched earth, it seemed impossibly fragile, and in its ruin, it whispered of horrors the town had never expected. Stayed quiet most of the morning, sitting on a nearby log, her hands trembling as she clutched her coat. She couldn't stop picturing Elias, his hollow eyes, the way he had reached for something he couldn't grasp. She replayed it over and over in her mind, the sound of the fire, the rush of heat, the way he'd fallen, still clutching the locket. The image pressed down on her chest like a stone, and even when she tried to look away, it lingered. She found herself whispering apologies to a man who wasn't there, words meant to soothe her own guilt. "I should have gone sooner. I should have made him leave." But it didn't matter. She hadn't been able to stop it, and that truth weighed heavier than the rain-soaked cold. Sheriff Tanner moved through the wreckage methodically, though his hands shook under the weight of what he saw. He had been in law enforcement for decades, seen his share of tragedy, but this felt different. The crime scene wasn't just destruction, it was chaos woven into the air itself. The burned hay, the melted lantern, the ashes of the portrait, all of it carried a weight beyond explanation. Tanner cataloged each detail, spoke to the fire investigators, and tried to reconstruct the events, but nothing fit neatly. His mind kept returning to the footprints leading into the woods. Small, impossible, as if someone, or something, had vanished into the earth itself. Word of the incident spread quickly through Clearwater. Newspapers printed the story with a cautious mixture of facts and speculation. A local farmer found dead in his burning barn, a mysterious locket, and the unanswered questions of who or what was involved. Some articles hinted at mental instability, painting Elias as a troubled recluse, the type who let grief consume him. Others were more cautious, questioning the origins of the fire and the strange reports from neighbors. In town, the mood shifted. The quiet farm community that had always prided itself on order and familiarity now felt vulnerable. Parents kept their children closer. Farmers double-checked their locks. People spoke in whispers when passing the empty lot, afraid that speaking too loudly might wake whatever had been disturbed that night. Returned to the general store later that week, attempting to return to normal life, but she could not. She avoided looking out the window at the empty fields, avoided the topic of Elias entirely. Inside, she struggled with guilt and fear. She knew rationally that there had been nothing she could do, but the helplessness gnawed at her. She replayed her visit over and over, her hesitation, her retreat, and felt the bitter sting of survivor's remorse. At night, she woke from nightmares of flames and shadows, unable to separate dream from memory. Her mind clung to every small detail of that night, each one a haunting echo. Tanner, too, felt the psychological toll. As the investigation stretched on, he found himself losing sleep. The photographs, the fragments of the burned portrait, the locket, all of it haunted him. He went over every conversation, every visit to the farm, replaying moments in which he might have acted differently, might have prevented what happened. He began to doubt the clarity of his own judgment, wondering if he had missed signs of Elias' instability, or worse, signs of something supernatural, that explanation. The shadow of the crime clung to him like a second skin. The town's perception of Elias shifted as well. Before the fire, he had been seen as a quiet, solitary man, eccentric perhaps, but harmless. Now whispers painted a different picture. Some suggested he had been obsessed, maybe even dangerous, long before the barn burned. Others refused to accept that, defending him as a good man caught in circumstances beyond his control. Clearwater became divided between rationality and fear, fact and rumor, the line between them blurring more with each passing day. In the days that followed, Tanner worked to collect what remained of the evidence. The fire had destroyed almost everything inside the barn, leaving only fragments of the past. The locket became central to the investigation, its pristine condition despite the blaze unnerving everyone who handled it. When Tanner opened it, he found a faded photograph. Caldwell, the woman from the old article, her eyes almost matching the ones in the portrait Elias had discovered. The discovery brought a chill that Tanner could not shake. It tied Elias' fate to a history far older than anyone had expected, a cycle that had somehow waited decades to resume. The psychological aftershocks touched others, too. Families in Clearwater began to lock doors more tightly, children were pulled indoors earlier, and casual walks across the fields grew less common. Even the land seemed altered. Farmers spoke of hearing strange sounds at night, of shadows that lingered near the edges of the trees. Some dismissed it as fear and imagination, others avoided the property entirely, unwilling to risk encountering whatever had caused the destruction. The air of normalcy that had long defined the town fractured, leaving unease in its place. His personal life shifted as well. She began to suffer panic attacks, small but intense, triggered by any sound that resembled the creak of the barn or the whisper of wind across the fields. Sleep became impossible without nightmares clawing at her mind. Even in daylight, she felt pursued by the memory of Elias' empty gaze, the cold hand reaching for the locket. She tried to speak to others about it, to share her experience, but found that no words were enough. Those who hadn't been there couldn't understand the weight of what she had witnessed. Tanner, feeling the pressure of both public scrutiny and personal doubt, pushed himself harder in the investigation. The fire was ruled accidental at first, though the circumstances surrounding Elias' death, the burned barn, and the locket complicated matters. Legal experts debated responsibility, mental capacity, and evidence, while locals speculated wildly, some convinced that Elias had been driven mad by the land itself or by the spirit of the woman in the portrait. Tanner listened to it all, recording facts, sorting through rumors, but the weight of uncertainty pressed down on him constantly. In private, Tanner revisited the burned barn repeatedly, walking among the charred beams and ashes, searching for any clue that might explain the inexplicable. Each time he felt the weight of the past pressing in, the unresolved deaths of the Caldwells, the strange circumstances that had haunted the land for decades, and now Elias' final, desperate confrontation. With each visit, Tanner grew more certain that this was more than just a tragedy of one man's grief. It was a legacy of something darker, a chain of obsession and violence that time could not erase. As the town slowly resumed some semblance of normal life, the emotional residue of the crime lingered. People moved cautiously, shadows seemed longer, and the empty lot where the barn once stood felt like a wound in the earth itself. Memories of Elias, of his isolation, and of the night of the fire became a cautionary tale whispered among families. The locket remained with Tanner, a silent reminder of what had been lost and of mysteries that might never be solved. Even months later felt the weight of the incident in every small moment, the creak of a floorboard, a distant storm, the reflection of light in a window. She could not forget. Clearwater itself carried the memory like a scar, visible only to those who knew where to look. The tragedy had changed them all, the town, the sheriff, and the land itself. And somewhere in the quiet, beneath the fields, beneath the ash of the burned barn, the sense of being watched lingered still, a silent echo of the night when obsession, fear, and history collided. The fire at the farm became a story that never quite left Clearwater. In the weeks and months that followed, the town struggled to reconcile what had happened with the memory of the quiet man who had lived among them for decades. Elias, once known simply as the solitary farmer, was now a symbol of tragedy, obsession, and the fragility of human sanity. There were no trials, no courtroom battles, because there was no one else responsible. The death of Elias was ruled an accident complicated by his mental state, but the verdict did little to ease the unease that lingered. People whispered about how grief, loneliness, and fixation on the past could lead a man to a final, irreversible act. Tried to rebuild her life, but the shadow of that night followed her everywhere. Her brief conversations with friends often ended awkwardly, and she could feel the unspoken questions in their eyes. How had she failed him? Could she have done something? Her nights were still haunted by the image of Elias on his knees, reaching for the glowing presence of the woman from the portrait. She sought therapy, tried to channel her feelings into community work, and yet the memory clung to her like a persistent ache. Even as time passed, she could not forget the mixture of terror and sorrow that had marked her last moments with him. Sheriff Tanner continued his duties with the same diligence as before, but the fire had changed him too. He carried the evidence, the locket, fragments of the portrait, photographs of the burned barn, everywhere he went, a constant reminder that not all mysteries could be solved by logic or law. He often thought about the Caldwells, the family whose tragedy had set the stage for Elias' final unraveling. Their unresolved deaths, buried in old records and faded newspapers, seemed to echo through time, suggesting that human pain and obsession could linger across generations. Tanner spoke little of what he had seen, but in his private moments, he acknowledged the uncomfortable truth. Some events were beyond justice, beyond reason, and yet they demanded attention, if only to remind the living of the delicate balance between curiosity and obsession. For Clearwater, the incident changed the rhythm of daily life. Where once the town had operated on familiarity and trust, now suspicion lingered. People were cautious, wary of unusual behavior, and more attentive to those who lived alone or exhibited signs of distress. The story of Elias became a cautionary tale, repeated at town gatherings and around kitchen tables. It reminded everyone that even the most ordinary-seeming lives could conceal dark depths, and that human behavior, shaped by grief, fear, and unresolved history, could lead to devastating consequences. The burned barn remained a silent landmark for years. The blackened beams were cleared, and eventually the land was replanted, but the memory of what happened lingered in the soil itself. Farmers spoke of strange sounds and shadows near the site, though skeptics dismissed them as imagination. Still, the story had imprinted itself onto the collective consciousness of the town. Elias' life, his descent into obsession, and his tragic death became a lens through which Clearwater residents examined their own fears, relationships, and the boundaries between solitude and isolation. From a societal perspective, the case underscored the consequences of neglecting mental health, particularly in small communities where help can be scarce. Elias' isolation, compounded by grief and unresolved questions about the past, contributed directly to the tragedy. It became clear that social systems, neighbors, friends, and even local authorities had failed to notice or intervene in subtle but significant ways. His death forced conversations about how communities respond to individuals struggling with loss, obsession, or psychological strain, and it highlighted the moral responsibility of those who witness warning signs but remain silent. The portrait and the history it revealed also reminded people of the power of legacy, memory, and the past's ability to shape the present. The unresolved fate of the Caldwells, and the way their tragedy resonated decades later, suggested that human actions, or inactions, can have consequences far beyond their immediate time. The story served as a reflection on power dynamics, both between people and within families, and the ways in which obsession, jealousy, and control can ripple outward, touching the lives of those who may seem completely disconnected. In the end, justice in the traditional sense was never fully served. No court could assign blame to a spirit, a portrait, or a long-dead family. Elias himself was both victim and perpetrator, caught in a psychological storm that had been centuries in the making. The tragedy left no one unscathed. Carried her guilt and grief, Tanner carried his doubts and unease, and Clearwater carried a scar in its history that would never fully heal. But within this darkness lay a quiet lesson about morality and human behavior. That the line between curiosity and obsession is thin, that grief can twist into something dangerous when left unchecked, and that even ordinary lives can hold extraordinary consequences when haunted by unresolved histories. Years later, the site of the barn remained empty, a field of grass and wildflowers with only a faint impression of the past. Those who lived in Clearwater spoke less of it as time passed, but the story never disappeared entirely. It lingered in whispers, in the way the wind moved through the trees, and in the uneasy quiet of long nights. The tragedy had reshaped the town's understanding of itself and the fragile, sometimes dangerous, complexity of human nature. Ultimately, the story of Elias was a reflection on the impermanence of life and the permanence of memory. It highlighted the consequences of isolation, the power of obsession, and how past sins can echo through generations. It forced the living to confront the uncomfortable truth that human behavior is rarely simple, that morality is often complicated, and that the boundaries between justice, fate, and tragedy are not always clear. The portrait, the barn, the fire, and the locket became symbols, not just of one man's final descent, but of the fragility of human connection, the weight of history, and the inescapable complexity of the human heart.